the Sustainability Management Master's Program, you are answering one simple question. Do you care about your future generation? If you care about your kids, their grandkids, then you care about sustainability. And a sustainability manager is someone who has the tools to make people understand how they can contribute towards developing a sustainable world. We have both part-time and full-time students. Our curriculum is 30 hours. Instead of thesis, we have a research project course and a seminar course which provides them with the kind of research background they will need to be successful in their job. At the same time, sustainability is not always everything about environment. It also relates to the business. They will take a sustainable business strategies course. They will take a project management course. Most of these courses are going to be taught by industry people, the people who are doing sustainability on a daily basis as a part of their job. Any organization that has a large number of employees and has a physical infrastructure, they will have to have a sustainability office. If you have the passion to develop and maintain a sustainable world, come to us and we will help you shape your passion into a career which will create an impact.
Good afternoon. Again, my name is Angelo Elmi. I'm a principal engineer for the New York City Transit. I work for the capital program management there. That means we basically have two systems, a capital program which seeks to do system improvements. We also have the operating force which drives the buses and the trains, keeps the system going on a daily basis. We're going to deal mostly with capital projects and the environmental planning of those projects. What is a capital project? Well, the way we define it anyway, it has to have capital funds. And capital funds usually come from Albany or the federal government. And they're set aside for, again, system improvements. For example, maybe building a new station, building a new 2nd Avenue subway. This is what you consider capital, as opposed to operating where, let's say you need to hire a new bus driver or buy a new bus to go on the system. Again, it's public money, it could be federal or state, and that invokes a series of different laws, whether it's state or federal. It's improving the system, it's not routine maintenance. And also private projects can be affected by our capital projects. We're mostly dealing with public projects as I speak, but you'll see how private projects can also be affected by environmental laws and things of that nature. What is environmental planning? Well, I think the goals, it's not easily defined, but I tried to define it today. I would say it's avoiding impacts to human health and the natural environment. That's in essence what environmental planning is. It's compliance with those laws and regulations, both on a federal, state, and local level. It also includes sustainability. Obviously, this is a term that's been really used in the last decade or so, greener approach, energy efficiency, etc. And that's all integrated now into environmental planning. I'm going to list the main regulations of again, planning a project. We have NEPA. How many have heard of NEPA? Okay, that's actually a good turnout. NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act, which kind of set the stage for many of our environmental laws. Then on the state level, we have the New York State SECRA, the State Environmental Quality Review. We're here in New Jersey, so I went to did some research in New Jersey. We have Executive Order 215. Then we go back to a local level. New York City has a very comprehensive planning manual to help us build projects in the city because it's very unique in the country because of the density and in the different neighborhoods in New York City. Then we'll touch on a little bit on permits, environmental permits and law, some of the more common ones that I deal with for our capital projects. We'll talk about site assessments, which are different, they're more integrated and more deal with more site-specific and hazardous materials on sites. And then we'll just look at some case studies. I'll try to bring it all together for you guys and just describe some of the projects I worked on. NEPA, as we said, is the National Environmental Policy Act. I thought this was a nice statement at the preamble of NEPA. And this is really a very important milestone in the country to try to bring forth and protect the environment. You could read it on the board there, but again, it's really trying to protect the environment as we progress and as we build new technology and new projects. It was really our greatest effort to try to plan correctly as we go forward. NEPA requires, again, federal agencies to consider and calculate the environmental effects of proposed actions before going through with those actions. Now, a federal agency, obviously those are defined, but it also affects if there's federal funding in the project, you have to follow NEPA. So it's any federal action. You have to look at both environmental, social, and economic effects. Some terminology with NEPA. These are the different levels of environmental review. This will probably be new to many people, maybe not. What we have is a CADEX, which we call categorical exclusion. These are run-of-the-mill projects, routine projects. The next step greater than that would be an EA or an environmental assessment. And that hopefully gets you a finding of no significant impact, the FONSI. And the last one at the end is an EIS, or environmental impact statement. And again, you have NEPA as the overarching environmental policy, and these different reviews, basically you're increasing your review once you go from top to bottom, the CADEX, the EA, and then the EIS. Some of the main impact areas and evaluation points. So NEPA makes you take your project and basically do a screening on it and look at the various impact areas that your project may affect. Public outreach is big in NEPA. They require you to go early and often to the public to get public input. Public has many times has good ideas, and they're very familiar with usually the area you're building in. So you look at various areas like traffic, socioeconomic, public open space, urban design, cultural resources, air quality, the whole gamut of environmental impacts. Here's an example of a NEPA timeframe, and I put a few timeframes up there just so that you realize that this is not a quick process. This can be a lengthy process, and this has to be integrated into your project schedule. So for example, scoping, which is just basically getting the project description out there, getting it out there to the public, maybe holding a scoping meeting. It's really formulating the project and getting a good, solid project description, and then going through the environmental impact statement process and reviewing the environmental impacts. And usually a typical EIS could take about 2 years before a project is launched. The New York SECRA law, State Environmental Quality Review, is analogous to NEPA, but again, specific to New York State. Much like the national guidelines, these are set for government agencies doing work. And here's just a little flow chart. It's usually a proposed action is created by the agency. For example, let's say MTA wants to build a new bus depot. You classify that action. You establish a lead agency. Usually it's the agency building the project. Then you determine a significance, and then you determine if an EIS is warranted. And finally, after you finish your environmental impact statement, you have findings and an agency decision on whether to go forward or not. But then you can finally build your project. So to give you examples, again, according to the SECRA law, there's different types of projects. According to SECRA, there's a type 1 project, and I'll give you an example of a type 1 would be building anything greater than 10 acres of undeveloped land. And that usually requires an EIS, just to give you some scale of what we're talking about here. So if I wanted to build a 10-acre parking lot, 10.5 acre, normally that would require an EIS because I have to look at a lot of impact areas, including traffic, air, noise, etc. Type 2, these are usually replacement in kind projects, and they require very minimal environmental review, if any. They may be exempt from the law. So example, if I, as an MTA owner, wanted to replace 3 miles of subway track, although it's a very long stretch, it's really replacement in kind, so it's not really affecting the environment because the track is already there. Building new track in a new area would be a different story. And then you have unlisted actions, which are they're not quite listed, they're not type 1, type 2, so they're kind of gray areas, so you have to use your judgment on whether you want to do an EIS or an EA. getting across the river into New Jersey, we have Executive Order 215. Is anybody familiar with Executive Order 215? Okay. Let me know if anything sounds incorrect. We have a level 1 study which requires, again, environmental assessment, or EA, and that's the lesser of the studies. Any public action, I guess, that costs is greater than $1 million would require an environmental assessment. And then you have level 2, which are projects that usually require an EIS, and they're over $5 million. However, there are many projects that are exempt. They don't want you to frivolously do environmental analysis. So there's a lot of replacement in kind projects that are exempt, maintenance or repair, expansion of existing buildings. They realize that many projects are just rebuilding or rehabbing the existing condition, so they don't want you to go through a process that's not necessary. Coming back to the local requirements, you have New York City Seeker, City Environmental Quality Review. Anybody heard of City Seeker? So if you go online, there's a pretty large manual, guidance manual on how you do environmental impact statements and environmental analysis in New York City. And it's really our adaptation of NEPA and SECRA into one manual. Because NEPA and SECRA are really just guidance. They talk in generic terms. I think they feel it's up to the professional judgment of the engineer or planner to do the appropriate environmental analysis. In the case of New York City, because of our population density, our building density, we have a set of guidance that we follow. And SECRA does very good. It's very good at almost like a cookie cutter or a good table of contents where you can look at that manual and go through the various impact areas. And I'll just go through each one with a little picture just to show you what type of analysis we were talking about. So let's say look at land use zoning and public policy. I don't know if you know, but New York City, I believe, was the first in the country to adopt zoning. So once you're in a certain neighborhood, you can only build certain things. You have zoning for manufacturing, commercial, residential. Fortunately, MTA is exempt from zoning because obviously we have a unique situation where we're building a transit system. But if you were a private developer or another public entity, you would have to maybe comply with zoning and build within the character of the neighborhood. Socioeconomic conditions. There's environmental justice, I don't know if you ever heard of, but you want to make sure that your project doesn't disproportionately affect minority or low-income populations. There's laws for that, and there's screening for that as well. Well, you don't want to affect any neighborhood you don't want to affect badly the socioeconomic condition of a neighborhood. So you have to study that for your particular project. So if I'm building a new subway station, usually that is a good thing for the socioeconomics of the neighborhood. Brings people in and allows people to get to the job markets. Community facilities and services. So if you're building a project in a certain neighborhood, you have to make sure that that neighborhood can accommodate your project. Does it have enough police? Does it have enough fire? Does it have enough schools to accommodate your project? Open space. Parklands are afforded lots of protection under the law. New York City has a lot of zoning for open spaces. You want to make sure that your project is not affecting the open spaces in an area where people can go and have recreational activities. Something unique to New York City is shadows. You want to make sure your project is not affecting an adjoining building. So for any building you build in New York City that has public funding and that is taller than 50 feet, you have to do a shadow analysis. So you would do a modeling, and you would see how the shadow affects adjoining buildings and even the streetscape. Historic and cultural resources. We have many buildings here in our area that are both have historic significance and cultural significance. So you would have a professional look to see how your project will impact those conditions, those sites. Urban design and visual resources. You'll see how your project is integrated into the neighborhood, to the aesthetics. You want to make sure that you're trying to fit into that and not be a blight on that particular neighborhood or site. Natural resources, you want to make sure you don't affect the water quality, wetlands of a particular site. We would hire third-party consultants and specialists to look at these, to see how this project is affecting the natural resources. Hazardous material. Anytime you build anywhere and you excavate, there are unknown conditions. You never know when you're on top of a Superfund site or if there's been illegal dumping at a site. You want to make sure you do your due diligence, do historic records, maybe do some soil borings to see where you build, to make sure that you're not going to encounter hazardous materials, or at least have a plan in place so that if you do encounter them, you know how to treat them. Water and sewer. Again, you're building a project. You want to make sure that you have water utilities. If people are living there, obviously they need potable water, sewer. You want to make sure that that facility or infrastructure can accommodate that new project. Solid waste and sanitation. Same thing, if you're building a building with a large number of people, you're going to produce garbage, and you want to make sure that those services are available and they can accommodate you. So you do a study to do that. Energy, again, you're building your project may have energy requirements, so you would do a study on to see if there's enough utilities in the neighborhood to accommodate you. This is very important for MTA when we build new stations. Obviously, we have large power requirements. We have trains running, we have a lot of lighting requirements, so we want to make sure we go to Con Ed, we tell them what we're going to do, and then they'll come back and give us comments on the project. Transportation, we want to make sure there's enough mass transit and roadways on your particular site to accommodate your project. Air quality. How will your project affect the air quality in the neighborhood? Both in construction, we both also study construction and operational impacts. So if you're building a new sewage treatment plant, how will that affect the air quality in the neighborhood? Or construction, how will the construction dust affect the air quality in the neighborhood, and what are you doing to mitigate that? Something that's been recently added, greenhouse gas emissions. How are you affecting the greenhouse gas emissions in the local region, your particular project, especially on the operating condition? What are you doing to mitigate that? Noise. Probably the biggest complaint that we get is about noise. Noise and vibration, I should say. Anytime you're doing any type of construction, again, you're in a very tight environment, especially in New York City. We have a specific New York City noise code that we have to follow. It's pretty strict. So many times jackhammers have to be outfitted with some type of noise mitigation equipment. And the workers can only work at a certain time, usually from the hours of, I would say, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. And if you want a variance, you'd have to go to the New York City DEP to get that variance. And even in your operational conditions, once you build your project, for example, if you're building a new subway station or a new building, will the trains passing by affect the residences that are nearby? And how will they affect the residences? So usually as part of the environmental impact statement, you would do noise modeling to see how receptors are affected. Neighborhood character. Again, do you fit into the general neighborhood character of the particular city or region that you're building in? Construction impacts. Construction impacts are, again, very big in the city, and very, very big for us. Because most of our projects, usually on the operational end, perform a good service. We give mass transit to people. Usually people like it. Sometimes people don't believe it. But usually construction impacts are our biggest issues, and then where we receive our biggest complaints for projects. Because they're lengthy projects, they're noisy projects, there are obviously lots of heavy machinery, so we try to do our best to accommodate the public. And general public health. How is your project affecting the general public health? Whether it's air quality, noise, aesthetics. I'll just go through now a little bit of environmental permits and laws, but it's a good place to stop.
So, a lot of aspects, and I'm thinking like some of them are fairly subjective, like fitting to neighborhoods, appearance, and so on. And some of them are objective, but getting to an answer requires a very sophisticated, probably expensive modeling, like all the, air pollution, CO2. So in practice, how people handle all those variables, each of them requires a PhD thesis to carefully analyze this.
Well, again, New York City, the SECR manual, the City Environmental Quality Review, gives pretty good guidance and tries to give quantitative analysis on how to do something. But a lot of it is subjective when you talk about neighborhood character or aesthetics. And I guess you do your best as a professional to try to go through that and to go through that screening process.
So is there also a similar procedure like antitrust cases that you bring, economists and lawyers on two sides to model it as much as they can and argue in front of court? Would you go to such cases where you require a testimony by an expert in environment, architecture, and things like that?
Well, I should preface that we are doing this work actually. And one of the reasons we do this work is not to get sued and to protect ourselves in court, because if someone doesn't want to stop the project, they could go to court and sue you. And if you're not following the law, and if you're not following the NEPA process or the SECR process, you could find yourself giving testimony. So you have to do your due diligence, make sure you have qualified professionals doing this work and doing it according to the proper standards.
So Angelo, do you have in-house staff who's doing this, or do you actually hire consultants from outside too?
A lot of the technical analysis, I would say, is consulting, because it requires sophisticated models, especially for air quality, traffic, and noise.
So I never heard of the shadow thing. This is the first time I'm hearing a shadow analysis.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's in the SECR manual. Doesn't affect us that much. We don't MTA that much because we don't usually go above 50 feet. But if you're a private developer, you may have to do a shadow analysis. And again, a lot of these laws are for public agencies, as I mentioned. But let me just give you an example of how a private developer can get hooked into these laws. So let's say I'm a developer and I want to build a skyscraper in Midtown. I put my permits in, and I may have to go to city planning to get an approval. In order for city planning to give that approval, they have to follow these public laws. So in essence, they're going to tell you, the developer, do a traffic study or do a shadow analysis to make sure that you're not affecting adjacent properties. So though you're a private person not subject to these laws, you may need public permits or public approvals, and those, to get that approval, they have to do their own analysis, and they'll pass that on to the developer. Yes.
I'm not sure if I saw any flooding impacts or water quality impacts.
I think I put natural resources.
Okay, so natural resources.
Yeah, I think it had like a cascading waterfall.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be integrated into water, wetlands.
And second question about MTA specifically.
Mm-hmm.
When you do flooding, for example, can you get credits, and in general with the seeker, can you get credits for one variance, a variance for one aspect of this EIS, so that you can use it,
To mitigate another portion where you're not doing so well?
Exactly, yeah. Is there a credit system like that, or?
There's not.
There's not.
There's not. No, if you're bad in one area, you have to fix that area. Traffic is an area that we're usually exceeding something, so usually performing some mitigation. For example, let's say I build a new bus depot. It'll come up later in one of the case studies. 200 buses on Staten Island at this particular intersection. So now I do a traffic study to see if that intersection can accommodate the traffic. I find out it can't. There's going to be a backlog. Unless I put new signals, I change the signal timing, I maybe make a new lane. So that has to be worked out. So just because maybe you're doing well in water quality doesn't mean that you can let the traffic go. You won't get credit. You have to fix that and get the approval from DOT in order to build that project. Any other questions on NEPA, SECRA?
Real quick question on, you talked about there being enough police, fire, whatever, to support your project. Being that you're a municipal agency, government agency, do you have to, the cost of that, is that part of your budget? Do you reimburse the agencies and the police department, or do you just draw from them, and if it's overtime, it's their budget, if it's additional cops or whatever, does that hit them or does that hit you guys?
It usually doesn't affect MTA, the community facilities, because I guess we provide for our own facilities, our own security.
Well, I'm just thinking like in terms of construction, you usually end up needing a lot of police to, keep people from walking into the holes and directing traffic.
Well,
and
for
stuff like
construction, what we do pay for is traffic agents.
that. Okay.
We close streets when we build our underground structures, obviously, or close sidewalks. And if they're busy intersections, we'll have to pay for traffic agents during the construction, which is part of MIPD, really. But I haven't come across a case where we pay for extra fire or police. Again, I see that more as a commercial development or residential development to make sure you have substantial fire, schools, and police. But we have paid for traffic agents. Okay, we'll just touch on a little bit about environmental permits and laws. Some of the main ones that I encounter, and a lot of big projects encounter. U.S. Coast Guard, when you're building in the water. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, also a big player in anytime you're doing work in the water. New York State DEC, also a lot of water work and air permits. U.S. DOT, a lot of our money comes from the Federal Transit Administration, which is part of the U.S. DOT. They give us probably $1 billion a year for a capital program, so they have also many requirements. And the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. We have around 50 transit sites that are listed on the National and State Register. So whenever we affect those historic structures, our own structures that we own, we have to go through the State Historic Preservation Office to make sure that the construction and the aesthetics are in accordance with the historic quality. One of the more common permits, anytime you're building or affecting water or wetlands, obviously very, very important as part of the environment, is the joint permit between Army Corps and DEC. So if I'm doing some construction on the water, for example, I'm doing some construction now on the A train in the Rockaways. We're rehabbing some of the track there, and we have to come with a barge. We would have to notify the Coast Guard, make sure that it is a navigable waterway, so they have to be notified. And also get the permit from DEC and Army Corps to make sure that we're using best management practices not to affect water quality and protecting the wetlands. And maybe they might make the decision that we have to mitigate the wetlands in some way. So many times, if the wetlands maybe are overgrown with invasive species, they'll make us mitigate and do it properly. Another popular permit is the State Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, Speedys Permit. That's meant for outfalls of stormwater into any type of water bodies. For example, for one of my projects, I had a bus depot that we had to build our own storm sewer because there were no utilities in the area in Staten Island. So we had to go through this process to make sure that we're not polluting any water body. We're building a new sewer, and we're making sure that the water that comes out of it is clean. We'll go through a case study on that. US DOT. I put a picture of a park here because you probably can't see it that well, but we have a particular law called 4F, which it's 4F of the US DOT Act of 1966. Parklands receive a lot of protection in the United States. Anytime you affect a park or try to take parkland, it's a very lengthy process. They want to make sure that you've looked at all your alternatives to avoid the park. And if you're going to affect the park, they want to make sure you're minimizing your impacts and mitigating it in a certain way. So we have subway stations that are adjacent to parks. Sometimes we have to take parkland, even just temporarily. So they want to make sure that we're doing it in a way that the public is happy, the public is notified, and that we're actually enhancing the park after we leave. Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. This council was created when the first historic preservation laws came out. I don't know if you know the story of Penn Station. Penn Station was a beautiful structure at one point and was taken down, I believe in the 60s. And I think that there was an outpouring of people concerned about historic preservation in the city, and then laws had started to come out on protecting historic preservation. Again, we have 50 sites in the New York City transit system. Anytime we build on those sites or affect those sites, we have to go through State Historic Preservation Office. Anytime we build next to a historic structure, they want to make sure that structure is protected and that we're not affecting or negatively affecting that structure. I'll just stop there since we're going to briefly into a new section, but any question on, I guess, on the main permits of the main agencies that a public agency may deal with?
So, how much time does it take to get all these permits? Is it quick enough or it's lengthy?
Each one is a special case. I would say that the Army Corps DEC joint permit for working in a water body or wetlands is on the order of 3 to 6 months, depending on the complexity of the project. Historic preservation, for a simple project, is usually around 30 days. So it really varies. Nothing should take more than a year, unless there's a lot of back and forth or they feel that you're not doing something properly. So it's really on the order of months, so you really have to integrate that into your schedule as you go forward.
So you partially answered. Is there any trade-off between different aspects? Let's say, you're in a poor neighborhood, you have plenty of parks, and you're building a station which is going to bring a lot of positive socioeconomic development in the cost of maybe polluting a little bit of local water or a park. Would there be a negotiation space that, I'm bringing a lot of good things, I'm making a bit of bad, but you have to strictly see those thresholds?
There is negotiation with the public. Community board approval, I would say, is very important in New York City. There's a very proactive public, very educated public, and informed public. There is trade-off. You can highlight your benefits, but you just have to remember that you really, you can't. Let's say you said, I think you gave the example of polluting the water a little bit. I mean, you can't go over any standard, any legal standard. So you're going to have to try your best to come within compliance, basically.
Yeah, water was a very special case, but
Yeah.
parks, other things which are not that heavily regulated.
I mean, we've promised, let's say we've done a lot of work in Battery Park, downtown Manhattan. We have the South Ferry Station there that was flooded during Sandy, so now we're doing a rehab of that station. That's probably going to open next year. And we had to take portions of the park for many months. And still, if you go there now, you'll see chain link over the park. We had to pay for that, basically. We paid for park enhancements. Sometimes it's just money, an exchange of money to say, basically, you're renting that space from us. So give us money, and then we'll use that to enhance the park. So you have to budget that into your project.
If you want to construct something underground or above ground next to a hospital, is there certain permits that you have to go for because the vulnerability is a little bit more higher than if you were to build next to another building?
Offhand, I'm not sure. You said a hospital?
Yeah, next to the hospital.
I mean, there are sensitive, what we call sensitive receptors. I would say a hospital, I could see noise and vibration impacts being an issue. We usually have problems with schools, noise and vibration issues. So I would say a hospital is a sensitive receptor. I would say it's usually noise and vibration. If there is, we also have building next to buildings that are weak structurally, things like underpinning, vibration monitoring, structural monitoring of the building. In that sense, a hospital would be the same as any type of structurally sensitive building. But hospital, I would say, noise and vibration would be an issue.
Do you guys get into any kind of jurisdictional battle, like when you're doing this, because of the various different agencies who are involved? For example, when you're dealing with water, on one side you have the DEP, or in whatever you call it, New York City DEC, and
Right.
then you have Coast Guard, they kind of get into it.
I would say the biggest jurisdictional battles we have is when we have to do construction at the same time with another agency. For example, the city may be doing water main, sewer, and street work on top of our, on top of our subway. So we have to coordinate, and we want to do maybe a structural rehab at the same time. So we have to coordinate with the agencies that are doing construction. And usually the DOT oversees that. The DOT doesn't want you to close the street for 1 year, and then you come and close the same street for another year. So they like you to coordinate your construction. We did have many battles with the New York State DEC, I think, in our past, when I think the capital program was just starting. I think many people, we have a lot of exemptions under the law, under our public authorities law. And people, I think, maybe were taking advantage of some of the environmental requirements. But I think now we're a little bit more conservative, and we usually try to be proactive with the agency and speak to them if we have questions. Usually construction coordination is a big deal with transit and DOT. Talk a little bit about environmental site assessments and and hazardous site investigations. We've been talking more at the planning end, the very beginning of a project. I would say that the hazardous site investigations may probably come a little bit later in the process and are a little bit more intrusive on the land which you're building on. Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3 environmental site assessments. It sounds very similar to environmental assessments on EISs, but they're a little different. I think we have somebody from Buckeye here who probably is very familiar with this type of work. Anytime we do a real estate transaction, buy new property, we want to make sure that we're not buying a Superfund site or a site that's heavily contaminated. So one of your first steps is to do a Phase 1 environmental site assessment. And that includes a site inspection, walking the site, a review of records, see what has been there in the past, if there's any illegal dumping, for any spills in the area, oil spills, underground storage tanks. And that is basically a record search. And then if you do have potential for something, your next step is usually to do a Phase 2. And that usually requires some type of intrusive activity like soil borings to take testing of the soil and groundwater, so that when you go into construction, you're not surprised that you have a lot of contaminated soil or water that has to be treated in a certain way. We have a pretty big program. Obviously, we do a lot of underground work. We do a lot of excavation. If we're in an area that we feel has high potential for contamination, and in New York City, usually contamination is petroleum contamination or perc from dry cleaners. Those are the two most common types of contamination we encounter. So if we feel we're in a problematic site, we'll go out there and do a survey and do soil borings prior to construction, take samples, get lab analysis, see what we have, so that we can properly design the project when we go out there and excavate. And then Phase 3 is usually the remediation or cleanup of the site. Sometimes we're the responsible party, sometimes we're not. Meaning sometimes we own the contamination, sometimes we're in the middle of the street and it's coming from a gas station adjacent to us. So that determines how much we have to clean up. But in the end, anytime you do construction, you have to handle the material in accordance with the law. You make sure the public is protected, make sure the workers are protected. Those are the main components.
One question on that.
Sure, sure.
If you guys hit someone else's contamination, do you take care of it, backfill them, or do you say, ExxonMobil, we hit a bunch of your contamination, clear this right away for us? Do you guys handle it, or do you just have them bring their guys in, or?
In my experience, I've been working probably public service 23 years now. We've tried to back sue people, back bill people, and it's never worked. It's just too costly to go to court. We'd rather go there, do our construction, remove any contaminated soil we encounter,
Right.
landfill it properly, take care of the groundwater, treat it if necessary,
Right.
either off-site or going into a sewer. Usually just trying to counter-sue somebody.
Well,
Just
you're
takes
not
too much
counting,
time.
like, if it's a known site, right, and you know you're going through their plume, I mean, there's no debate, it's this guy, it's Dow, or it's whatever. That could be, number one, that cost to get rid of that soil's a lot, plus two, you don't want it going into the landfill.
We tried to build them the premium.
Yeah, but
It
you
hasn't
also,
worked in my experience.
you also would rather have them be the generator than you, because, going to the.
Sure,
I'm
sure.
curious how that Because
We usually end up taking the liability of being the
Okay.
generator, because we're usually in the right of way, we're usually in the public
Yeah.
street,
yeah.
and we usually end up being the generator and taking up the liability.
Okay. The other thing I'll just say too, I'll throw my 2 cents in it. Phase 1, 2, and 3, that phase 1 is actually, the paper chase is really the most
Paper?
important. That can tell you right off the bat that you want nothing to do with this site. I mean, sometimes just
Exactly.
looking at the paper, you don't have to put a shovel in the ground.
Mhm.
You look at what used to be there, an ore processing facility or an oil plant or something like that, and it's like, now we're going to a different, we're going somewhere else, or we need a lot more money. But
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest problems is finding real estate for us, in New York City.
Yeah, so because
Land
you guys
is
find
scarce.
something, you pretty much have to make it,
Right.
work, yeah.
And the land that is available is probably contaminated.
That's why it's
probably
available.
abandoned, right, so it's abandoned, or somebody would have snatched it up already. So we end up going into contaminated sites and then figuring out if we want to take that liability or can afford the cleanup costs of taking that brownfield, I guess you could say.
Right.
But, finding land is a big part of our capital program. When we need a new bus depot, or let's say the Second Avenue subway, when we're going outside of our right-of-way. I'll go through a couple of case studies now just to highlight some of the important issues. These are tremendous projects. These are big projects in that you could spend an hour on each of them if you wanted to. But I'll just highlight certain areas that I think are important and kind of emphasize what I've spoken about. Tappan Zee Bridge, I'm sure many of you know that the Tappan Zee Bridge is being replaced and is under construction as we speak. It was the new New York Bridge. It was obviously there to keep the vital connection between Rockland and Westchester County. MTA was involved. I believe they were thinking about putting a rail line on the bridge. I don't think it's going on now, but I think that is a future possibility. DIS was completed both under NEPA and SECRA because they did receive federal money. Both laws were complied with. And obviously, they did an extensive alternative analysis when they did the Tappan Zee Bridge. Lots of waterworks, so you had lots of permits, Coast Guard, it's a navigable waterway. Army Corps and DEC are doing dredging, moorings in the water, a lot of construction in the water. So you had to get vital permits and make sure you're following best management practices not to affect the water quality while you're building the bridge. One of the studies I had found out in my research is that they wanted to see how the wildlife or aquatic life was being affected when they're doing pile driving for the bridge. And they did, I think, find out that some aquatic life is traumatized by pile driving, noise and vibrations. So they tried to mitigate as best they could during the construction process.
Good psychological health for the fish.
Yeah. Just to give you an example of the timeline of this project. So New York State decided, announced the start of an EIS, Environmental Impact Statement, in November 2000. The EIS was published in 2002, and it took 10 years to develop that EIS into a draft form, March 2012. So they went through extensive alternative analysis and impact analysis, community outreach, community boards. I'm sure a lot of politics were at play, budget is at play, but it took, again, you can see from 2002 to 2012. Then I put a biological opinion in June 2012 as part of the draft EIS. I'm just highlighting that to show that that was a major concern as they were building the bridge. And the final EIS was done in July 2012. The record of decision is usually the conclusion of that EIS by the federal and state agencies to move the project forward and move it with probably mitigation of all the impacts that have occurred. So you can see that from announcing the start of an EIS in 2000 and actually starting construction sometime there about 2012. Took over a decade to start this project. One of my projects, we have a potential bus BRT, bus rapid transit, on Staten Island's North Shore. Here's the segment. This is an abandoned freight line in orange. It's about a 10-mile stretch. It goes from St. George to the terminal in almost right across from New Jersey. And we're taking that abandoned freight line and hoping to build bus rapid transit on it. It's a little bit too expensive, we feel, to try to reuse the track and put a subway corridor there, which would be probably double the price. So it would be much easier to use that land and maybe put bus rapid transit to move people to the St. George terminal from the west side of Staten Island to St. George terminal. And that's being studied as we speak. Put the little bus on the tracks. There's a picture of the abandoned freight line. A lot of things that we have to look at are property ownership. We're adjacent to properties all along the right of way. Sometimes we maybe need a little bit more space, so we have to do real estate transactions or try to get additional property. Shoreline stabilization and resiliency. Since Hurricane Sandy, our standards have changed in terms of flood protection. We're no longer just designing to the 100-year flood, which was done for many years in the 100-year floodplain. Now we're designed to category 2 plus 3 feet, which is probably the equivalent of the 500-year flood plus 2 or 3 feet. So a much higher design standard for work near the water. So we'd have to rebuild the bulkhead there, as you see. Noise and visual impact for residences. Now instead, if you live there, instead of an abandoned freight line, you now have buses running in your backyard. So you want to study how the noise or the visual impact will affect you. And we're also looking at pedestrian access, whether we put a bikeway there or a walkway. And I guess this would go through the EIS process. And we would seek to get federal money, so we'd go both through NEPA and SECRA. MTA Charleston Bus Depot, this I worked on a few years ago. We built a new bus depot in Staten Island. Approximately, I believe it was 150 buses, an outdoor parking lot. This went through the federal environmental assessment process. Not big enough for an EIS, but a little bit lower screening than the EA. The entire process took about a year to do the environmental analysis. It included a 30-day public comment period when we went out to the community board. That's a required public comment period. And FDA issued a finding of no significant impacts were found. Obviously, we look at, when we build a new bus depot, when we induce traffic, new buses in the area, we're looking at air, traffic, and noise. Those are the big three. We have a lot of mitigation, I'll go through quickly, measures there because we had to build our own storm sewer. So we went through the Speedys process from New York State DEC. So you basically have undeveloped land where water is filtering into the ground, but now you paved it, so now you have to take that water and drain it properly. So we had to build a new storm sewer going into the Arthur Kill. It was a challenging construction site because there was lots of clay, did not filter well. As you can see on the dry day, we have a swimming pool. It was very difficult to stop that construction water from going into the street. So we were going to try to capture it and then let it filter it down to the underlying sand layer, which was a little bit deeper. You could see hay bales around there during the construction site to try to stop silt and sediment from getting onto the street and onto the water body. This was protecting the catch basin. Eventually we set up hydrodynamic separators in the parking lot, which would capture any silt or sediment. We go through a baffling system and chamber system to collect any sediment from the parking lot before we would discharge it through the outlet pipe. Last, the 2nd Avenue subway just opened on New Year's Day. It's a long project in the making. This is an extension right now of the Q line that goes up to 96th Street on the Upper East Side. Finally gives residents of the Upper East Side a mass transit segment where they can get quickly to Union Square. And it alleviates crowding on the 4-5 Lexington line if you've ever taken the 4-5 train. Main issues in construction, main issues for the 2nd Avenue subway On an operational case, you know, the subway is obviously a benefit. It's so deep that most people don't know it's running. You don't feel vibration. You know, we use the TBM. It's within the bedrock. However, construction lasted a long time. People were affected. You have lots of air traffic, noise, dust control that had to be dealt with during the construction process. And probably the biggest problem where MTA probably was sued in several places for real estate acquisitions. Even though the subway's underground, we have to get above ground, so we need station entrances, we need ventilation gratings, we need vent plants, all to service the underground tunnel. That requires real estate. And in an area that's really congested, so sometimes you have to take land, you try to buy it, but you also sometimes have to go through condemnation or eminent domain procedures and forcefully take the land. And these are some of the main issues for Second Avenue subway. Just to give you a quick timeline on how long this process may take, a draft EIS was issued in 1999, a final EIS in 2004. We began construction on phase 1 2007, and it just opened in December 2016, December 31st. So you can see these are decades in the making, these projects. Just the points to come away with: check or review laws that apply for when you're building a project. Make sure you involve agency and community stakeholders, community boards, and any agencies that you think might be affected. Go to them early and often. Look for similar projects in your region to see what type of impacts they've had, and anticipate lead times for approvals for your project so you can schedule them accordingly. This is Engineers Week, so totally graphic. Do you have any questions?